The autumn breeze in downtown Atlanta carried with it a sense of unease, like a storm that had yet to break. Isaiah Carter, a man who appeared to be just another professional in a crisp navy suit, strode confidently down the sidewalk, blending in with the sea of busy office workers. But Isaiah was no ordinary man. Beneath his calm exterior lay a mind sharpened by years of deep cover operations as one of the CIA's most elite agents. He wasn't just walking to a coffee shop or heading to a meeting. He was preparing for war. Isaiah's mission in Atlanta was unlike any he'd taken before. For the past 6 months, he'd been working undercover to expose a network of corrupt police officers who had turned the city's justice system into their own playground. Officers like Detective Ryan Mitchell and Detective Scott Larson had been operating under the radar, planting evidence, extorting citizens, and covering up their illegal activities. Isaiah's job was simple: gather enough evidence to bring them down. On the surface, Isaiah looked like any other cybersecurity consultant. His tailored suit, his leather messenger bag, and his confident stride all screamed success. But his eyes, always scanning his surroundings, told a different story. He had been here before, many times, tracking those who believed they were untouchable. What they didn't know was that Isaiah had already built a case against them that could bring their entire empire crumbling down. He paused outside Tanya's coffee shop, his sister's business, taking a brief moment to survey the street. His instinct had never failed him, and today was no different. Satisfied, he pushed open the door. The familiar bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside, and the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee beans wrapped around him, calming his senses for just a moment. "There's my favorite brother!" Tanya's voice rang out from behind the counter, her bright smile never quite hiding the worry she had noticed in Isaiah's demeanor lately. She was the one person who knew him best, and even she had begun to notice the subtle changes in him, the way he tensed when the door opened, the constant scanning of the room, the silences that stretched far too long during their weekly dinners. Isaiah returned her smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, sis, just busy with work." Same old," he replied, settling into his usual corner seat. He positioned himself with a clear view of both exits. Old habits died hard. His laptop screen flashed lines of code, but his mind was far from the work in front of him. His focus remained fixed on the street outside, and more specifically on the 2 detectives he had been tracking for weeks. Mitchell and Larson were part of a much larger operation, and he knew that today could be the day it all came crashing down. "Sure you're fine?" Tanya asked softly, placing his usual black coffee in front of him. "You look tired. When was the last time you actually slept?" Isaiah glanced at her, offering a smile that was as convincing as he could manage. "I sleep enough. Just some complex projects to wrap up. Nothing too serious." But Tanya wasn't convinced. She lingered at the table for a moment longer, her gaze studying him carefully. "If something's wrong, you know you can talk to me, right?" Isaiah reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I know, sis. I'm just trying to keep things in order, that's all." The truth was, he couldn't tell her everything. Not now. Not when her safety was on the line. For the past 6 months, he had been gathering evidence against the corrupt officers, but revealing his mission would put her life at risk. The CIA's deep cover operations were never meant to be shared with anyone outside the agency, especially not with family. The situation in Atlanta was already tense, and the moment Isaiah had been waiting for was getting closer. He knew that Mitchell and Larson, confident in their power and control over the city's law enforcement, were getting sloppy. They were looking for their next scapegoat, and Isaiah had become their perfect target. The game had begun, but Isaiah was already 3 moves ahead. In a dimly lit office across town at the Atlanta Police Department, detectives Ryan Mitchell and Scott Larson reviewed the latest reports from their operation. Mitchell, with his greying hair and weary eyes, leaned back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair. His partner, Larson, a larger-than-life figure whose muscular frame matched his ego, paced the room, clearly on edge. "Things are getting too close," Larson muttered, his voice filled with tension. That last operation was sloppy, if anyone starts asking the right questions, we're done. Mitchell waved him off, dismissing the worry with a flick of his hand. "They won't. We own this precinct, and the judge is on our payroll. We just need a clean fall guy for a while, someone with no connections, someone like Isaiah Carter." Larson stopped pacing, the cruel smile on his lips betraying the sinister nature of their plans. "Someone no one will miss. Someone we can throw under the bus and make everything look like a clean arrest." Mitchell nodded, his mind already turning over the logistics of the setup. Carter had been on their radar for a while, a quiet black cybersecurity consultant who seemed to blend into the background. But they'd heard rumors about his past, about his connections. They didn't know exactly who he was, but they didn't care. What mattered was that Carter was the perfect scapegoat. He had no family, no connections to powerful people. His arrest would be a mere blip on the radar, just another fall guy to get them out of hot water. The media would latch onto it, and the narrative would be set. The case would be closed. At that moment, the door to their office opened with a soft creak, and Officer Sarah Walker, one of the few honest cops left in the precinct, stepped inside. Her expression was a mixture of disgust and concern. "There's been another complaint about excessive force in the 4th Ward," she said, her voice barely concealing the frustration she felt. "Another innocent person in the wrong place at the wrong time." Mitchell's face darkened. "File it with internal affairs," he snapped, clearly uninterested in hearing the details. "I'm sure they'll give it all the attention it deserves." Walker's eyes narrowed, but she didn't say another word. She turned and left the room, the door clicking shut behind her. Mitchell and Larson exchanged a glance. They both knew that there were more and more whispers about their operation, cops who were starting to question their methods, people who were beginning to put pieces together. But as far as they were concerned, they were untouchable. They had a system in place, one that had been working for years. Back in his car, Isaiah Carter sat quietly, waiting for his niece Maya to come out of school. He glanced at his phone, reading the encrypted message from his CIA handler. "Evidence suggests imminent major operation. Stay alert." He deleted the message before Maya bounded down the steps of Wilson Elementary, her backpack bouncing with each excited step. "Guess what, Uncle Isaiah?" she exclaimed as she climbed into the car. "We learned about butterflies today. And did you know they start as caterpillars? Then they turn into something called a chrysalis before they become butterflies." Isaiah smiled at her innocent excitement. These small moments with his family were what he was fighting to protect. His mind, however, was always on the job. His training had taught him to compartmentalize, to focus on the task at hand, no matter what. He needed to stay calm and alert, but today he felt something in the air. Something was about to change. As he pulled away from the school, he noticed a familiar, unmarked police car turning onto the street. His grip tightened on the steering. A wheel, as he recognized Mitchell behind the wheel. He forced himself to stay calm, shifting the conversation back to Maya's butterfly story. But deep down, he knew the moment was coming. He could hear his CIA training in his head, reminding him to stay calm, to remain in control. He had learned how to handle dangerous situations like this one, how to survive when you were outnumbered, when the odds were stacked against you. But what he didn't realize was that the trap Mitchell and Larson were setting for him wasn't one he could escape from. It was one they were too blind to see until it snapped shut around them. At the next red light, Isaiah's heart rate remained steady, a product of years of training. He could feel the tension in the air as Mitchell's car pulled up behind him. He had a decision to make: Reveal his CIA status and risk compromising months of investigation, or play along and hope he could find a way out? As the lights turned green, the decision was taken out of his hands. Bright lights suddenly flooded the car. Isaiah's heart skipped a beat. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where Mitchell's car was now surrounded by two other police vehicles. His pulse remained steady, but everything in him knew this was it. This was where the game would change. "Maya," Isaiah said in a low voice, trying to keep the panic out of his tone. "Whatever happens, you stay in the car and call your mum. Can you do that for me?" Maya nodded, unaware of the danger that was closing in on them. She began to dial her mother's number just as Isaiah slowly reached for the door handle, trying to maintain the calm he had learned over the years. He had no idea how things would play out, but he was prepared for whatever was coming next. The moment the bright lights flooded Isaiah's car, everything shifted. Isaiah's mind raced through his options, calculating every possible move, every possible outcome. Years of CIA training had prepared him for moments like this. Moments where the situation spirals out of control, and survival depends on patience and quick thinking. But this wasn't just about survival. This was about something much bigger. He had been investigating the corruption within the Atlanta Police Department for months, carefully gathering evidence against Mitchell, Larson, and their network of criminals. But now, with the arrival of these unmarked police vehicles, his world seemed to crash in on itself. The blaring sirens, the shouts from the police megaphone, everything felt like a well-rehearsed script. But Isaiah was no ordinary man. He didn't panic. He didn't crack under pressure. He stayed calm, his hand resting on the door handle, his gaze shifting between the officers outside and Maya, who was already dialing her mother. "Maya, stay. In the car. Call your mum and don't open the door," Isaiah said softly, his voice steady. Maya, frightened but obedient, nodded, not fully understanding the gravity of the situation. Isaiah could see her face through the rearview mirror, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. But there was nothing he could do to shield her from what was about to happen. His heart ached, but he couldn't show it. Not now. The order came again, louder this time. "Driver, exit the vehicle with your hands where we can see them." Mitchell's voice boomed through the megaphone. Isaiah's mind shifted gears. There was no room for mistakes. He slowly opened the door, his movements deliberate, his face betraying nothing of what he was thinking. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos around him. As soon as his feet hit the ground, the police swarmed him. Mitchell and Larson rushed forward, shoving him to the ground with a brutal force. His face slammed against the concrete, splitting his lip and causing blood to spill onto the pavement. The impact felt almost insignificant compared to the fight that raged in his mind. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom anymore, he was fighting for the truth. Larson's voice sounded above the confusion, announcing triumphantly, "Look, what we found." Isaiah's heart sank as he saw the package Larson pulled from his jacket, a neatly wrapped bundle of what looked like drugs. Mitchell, quick to capture the moment, snapped photos of the planted evidence, while other officers kept their weapons trained on Isaiah, ensuring he didn't make any sudden moves. It was all part of the plan. The media would latch onto this. They would paint Isaiah as the villain, the criminal. The case would be closed, and another innocent life would be destroyed. But Isaiah didn't panic. He couldn't afford to. His mind worked furiously to keep track of the plan, of every detail, every piece of the puzzle. The evidence was fabricated. He knew that, but it was convincing. And worse, the entire system, Mitchell, Larson, and the corrupted network they were a part of, was designed to make sure it would stick. Inside the car, Maya's terrified screams pierced the air as she looked on helplessly. The officers quickly moved in to confiscate the bystanders' phones, trying to prevent any footage from reaching the media. Mitchell's voice rang out, filled with disdain as he yanked Isaiah to his feet. "Isaiah Carter, you're under arrest. for possession with intent to distribute and illegal weapons possession. Isaiah remained silent, his jaw clenched. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. His compliance only seemed to unsettle them. They were used to seeing suspects beg, cry, or fight back. But Isaiah wasn't just another man caught in their web of lies. He was something far more dangerous. "You have nothing to say?" Larson taunted as he roughly shoved Isaiah toward the patrol car. "No claims of innocence. No, those aren't my drugs?" Isaiah's silence spoke volumes. It didn't fit the narrative they had built. The police officers around him couldn't understand why he wasn't reacting the way they were used to, but they wouldn't get it. They never would. Back at the precinct, Mitchell and Larson threw Isaiah into a small, grimy interrogation room. The air smelled stale, the fluorescent lights buzzing above as they began their routine. The same tricks they used on every other suspect: threats, promises of leniency, and attempts to play good cop, bad cop. They believed that under pressure, Isaiah would crack. They thought he was just like the others they had framed over the years. "You're just another black man caught with drugs," Mitchell sneered, leaning in close to Isaiah's face. "Who do you think they'll believe? Two decorated detectives or you?" Isaiah's calm gaze never wavered. He was cataloging every word, every threat. His mind was working even as they tried to break him down. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Not now, not ever. Larson, standing off to the side, chimed in, "You should have stayed. In your lane, Carter. Now you're just another statistic." The room felt colder with each passing moment, the silence between them suffocating. Mitchell and Larson were confident. They were certain that they had won. But they had underestimated Isaiah Carter. They had no idea what they had walked into. They thought they were framing a helpless man. What they didn't realize was that they had just given Isaiah a front-row seat to their entire operation. Hours passed in the interrogation room as the detectives tried every tactic they knew. They tried to break Isaiah with promises, threats, and intimidation. But he remained silent. He knew what they wanted. They wanted him to plead, to confess. They wanted him to play into their hands. But that was a game Isaiah wasn't going to lose. Later that afternoon, the media circus began. The local news stations ran with the story, their corrupt sources feeding them a narrative that painted Isaiah as the villain. They showed carefully selected photos that made him look menacing. Photos taken from his cybersecurity work, where he was investigating corrupt systems and criminals. They ignored his years of community service, his professional achievements, his commitment to his family. Instead, they painted him as just another drug dealer caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. In her coffee shop, Tanya watched the news coverage with growing horror. For the first time, she understood the changes in her brother, the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly swept the room, the long silences during their weekly dinners. She didn't know the full extent of what he had been dealing with, but she knew one thing. Isaiah wasn't the criminal they were making him out to be. She had to do something. "I need to find him a lawyer," she muttered, her fingers trembling, as she pulled out her phone. Someone who wasn't afraid to take on the police. Someone who could expose the truth. Meanwhile, in a secure facility across town, Isaiah's CIA handler watched the situation unfold with growing concern. The operation had taken an unexpected turn, but perhaps this could be used to their advantage. For now, Isaiah needed to maintain his cover, even if it meant spending time behind bars. But Isaiah wasn't broken. He was waiting. The perfect trap had been set. And Mitchell and Larson were already 3 moves behind. As dawn broke over Atlanta, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. The case against Isaiah Carter was no longer just a local issue. It had become a spectacle, a national story. The media, Coverage intensified as the public eagerly awaited the trial of the cybersecurity expert who had been framed by the city's most corrupt detectives. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and legal observers, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had become a symbol of justice in the face of overwhelming adversity. Isaiah sat at the defense table, his demeanor calm and composed, a stark contrast to the storm that raged around him. His navy blue suit was neat and pressed, his posture upright, exuding an air of professionalism that seemed to unsettle those around him. Beside him sat his attorney, David Keller, a seasoned civil rights lawyer known for taking on difficult cases involving police corruption. Keller had agreed to take on Isaiah's case just hours after he was arrested, sensing that this case was far bigger than it initially appeared. In the gallery, Tanya sat with Maya, her eyes fixed on her brother. Tanya had always known Isaiah as a quiet, introspective man, but the events of the past few days had revealed a side of him she had never fully understood. She knew he was different. His intelligence, his poise, his ability to read people, but she never realized just how much Isaiah had been sacrificing to protect their city. Now, as she sat in the courtroom, Tanya understood. Her brother was fighting for more than just his freedom. He was fighting to expose a corrupt system that had been manipulating and destroying lives for years. Judge Elizabeth Hawthorne entered the courtroom, her black robe sweeping across the floor as she took her seat. She was a no-nonsense judge, known for her strict rulings and her unwavering commitment to upholding the law. However, even she could not ignore the growing pressure from the media, the public, and the federal authorities that had started to take an interest in the case. Hawthorne cleared her throat, signaling for the proceedings to begin. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today to hear the case of the state of Georgia versus Isaiah Carter," she said, her voice firm and authoritative. "The prosecution will present its evidence, and the defense will respond in turn. I expect all parties to conduct themselves in an orderly fashion." Keller stood, his tall frame casting a shadow over the courtroom as he addressed the jury. His voice was calm but commanding, and he wasted no time in establishing his strategy. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Keller began, "the case you are about to hear is not just about one man. It is about the systematic corruption that has plagued this city's police force, a corruption that stretches deep into the very heart of the justice system. The evidence you will see today has been fabricated. Isaiah Carter is not the criminal the prosecution would have you believe. He is a man who has dedicated his life to uncovering the truth, a man who has been targeted because he got too close to the truth." The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Sarah Reynolds, wasted no time in countering Keller's opening statement. Reynolds was a seasoned prosecutor, known for her aggressive tactics and her unwavering belief in the system. She had been determined to see Isaiah convicted, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. "The evidence against Mr. Carter is clear," Reynolds said, her voice dripping with disdain as she gestured toward Isaiah. "We have security footage showing him engaging in a drug transaction. We have physical evidence recovered from his vehicle. And we have the testimony of two decorated police officers, Detective Mitchell and Detective Larson, who witnessed the entire event. Mr. Carter was caught red-handed, and he has no one but himself to blame for his actions." As Reynolds finished, she turned and motioned for Detective Mitchell to take the stand. Mitchell, looking weary and disheveled, stood and walked toward the witness box. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous tension that was palpable in the air. He swore to tell the truth, and then began recounting the events that led to Isaiah's arrest. "We received a tip about possible drug activity near Wilson Elementary," Mitchell began. "We were conducting surveillance in the area when we saw Mr. Carter engage in what appeared to be a drug transaction. We approached his vehicle, and that's when we found the drugs and the unregistered firearm. Mitchell's testimony was smooth, rehearsed, and convincing. He spoke with such confidence that it was hard to believe he was lying. He described the arrest in vivid detail, painting a picture of Isaiah as a cold and calculating criminal. The jury listened intently, their eyes fixed on Mitchell as he testified, but Keller was ready. He stood and approached Mitchell with a folder in his hand. "Detective Mitchell," Keller began, his voice calm and measured, "you testified that you observed Mr. Carter conducting a drug transaction. Can you tell the jury exactly how long you watched him before making your approach?" Mitchell hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. "It was about 5 minutes," he said, his voice shaky. 5 minutes? Keller repeated. "That seems like an unusually long amount of time to wait before intervening in a drug transaction, especially when you knew there were children in the area." Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. "We were making sure the area was safe," he replied, his voice losing its earlier confidence. Keller raised an eyebrow. "And yet, in your report, there is no mention of any attempt to apprehend the alleged buyer. Why is that?" The tension in the room was palpable as Mitchell struggled to maintain his composure. It was becoming clear that Keller was not going to let him get away with the inconsistencies in his story. The detective's face reddened, and for a moment he seemed unsure of what to say. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Mr. Keller, I remind you to keep your questions relevant to the case at hand," Judge Hawthorne warned. Keller nodded, but it was clear that the seeds of doubt had been planted. Mitchell's testimony no longer seemed as airtight as it had at the start. The jury began to shift in their seats, exchanging glances as they processed the implications of Keller's questions. Next, Larson took the stand, his demeanor no less confident than Mitchell's had been. He recounted the arrest in almost identical terms, his story mirroring Mitchell's with eerie precision. However, Keller was ready once again, and he wasted no time in poking holes in Larson's account. Keller didn't miss a beat. "And how do you know this?" he asked. "Were you ever a part of these actions?" Garcia looked at Keller, his face filled with regret. "I was part of it at first," he admitted. "But I couldn't live with myself anymore. I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people suffer, so I left. I couldn't take it anymore." The room was in shock as Garcia's testimony continued. It was clear that this man had been living with the weight of his past for a long time, and now he was finally ready to face the truth and make things right. "I've been following the case closely," Garcia said. "When I heard that Mr. Carter had been framed by Mitchell and Larson, I knew I had to come forward. They did this to a lot of people. I've seen them do it before, and they thought they could get away with it again, but I'm here to tell you they won't." The impact of Garcia's testimony was immediate and profound. It was as if the entire case had shifted. The jury's perception of Isaiah, once clouded by the prosecution's false narrative, now shifted toward belief in his innocence. But the most significant effect was on the prosecution's case. Sarah Reynolds, once so confident in her victory, stood frozen, struggling to come up with a response. Isaiah, sitting quietly at the defense table, couldn't help but feel a surge of relief. He had always known the truth, but now, with Garcia's testimony, the rest of the world was finally starting to see it too. But his battle wasn't over. This was just one small victory in a much larger war. The real fight was just beginning. As Garcia's testimony concluded, the courtroom was filled with murmurs of disbelief. Some of the spectators had already started to form opinions, while others were too stunned to speak. It was clear that the public perception of the case had shifted dramatically, but the wheels of justice still had a long way to go. Later that evening, Tanya sat in her apartment, reflecting on the events of the day. She had always known Isaiah was special, but now she realized the full extent of his bravery. It wasn't just about fighting for justice, it was about risking everything to expose the truth. and in doing so, he had become a symbol of hope for countless others who had been victimized by the system. Her phone buzzed, and a message from Isaiah popped up on the screen. "I'm not done yet," the message read. "The fight has just begun." But today was a good step forward. Tanya smiled softly, knowing that her brother wasn't just a hero in her eyes. He was a hero to everyone who had ever been silenced by corruption, and he was about to change the course of their city forever. The courtroom was buzzing with the aftermath of Garcia's explosive testimony, but the real battle was still far from over. The defense had just dealt a blow to the prosecution's case, but with Detective Mitchell and Larson in control of so much of the evidence, the challenge remained formidable. Despite this, Isaiah knew that the tide had turned in. His favor and the momentum was shifting. This was not just about him anymore. This was about every person who had been wronged by the corrupt system that had long held Atlanta in its grip. David Keller, Isaiah's defense attorney, had been quiet but focused throughout the day. He understood that this moment, this piece of critical testimony, had opened the door to something much larger than anyone had anticipated. The jury, once doubtful, was now forced to reckon with the reality that Mitchell and Larson were not just rogue officers. They were the tip of a much larger iceberg, and the people responsible for this corrupt empire were scrambling to protect themselves before the truth came out completely. Late that night, as the courtroom emptied, the weight of the case seemed to hang over Isaiah's shoulders. He sat alone, in his cell, contemplating everything that had led him to this moment. The false charges, the framing, the endless hours of interrogation, all of it was part of a much larger picture. What he had originally thought would be a covert mission to dismantle a small operation had quickly spiraled into a far-reaching investigation that could expose systemic corruption in multiple sectors of law enforcement, not just in Atlanta, but across the country. In the dim light of his cell, Isaiah reflected on his training. His CIA experience had prepared him for everything that had come his way. From the moment he had been arrested and framed, he had kept his cool, his mind constantly working on strategies, always thinking 3 steps ahead. He knew that Mitchell and Larson, though seasoned officers, were not prepared for a player like him. They had underestimated him at every turn, and now it seemed the walls were closing in. Across town, Detective Mitchell and Larson were not enjoying their evening in quite the same way. They sat in a small, private room at the police precinct, trying to come to terms with the avalanche of evidence that was piling up against them. Both men had known their careers were on the line, but now the magnitude of what was happening was sinking in. They had assumed they could control the narrative, fabricate the evidence, intimidate the witnesses, and manipulate the system to their benefit. But now they were facing an opponent they couldn't defeat. The truth. "You've got to be kidding me," Larson muttered, leaning back in his chair. His face was pale, the weight of the situation evident. "That Garcia guy, he's blowing everything wide open. He's seen too much. We're done." Mitchell sat across from him, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He was trying to remain calm, but it was clear that their empire was crumbling around them. "We've been through worse," Mitchell said, his voice filled with forced confidence. "We just need to hold on a little longer. There's still time. We still have the evidence. We can make sure the trial goes in our favor." Larson shook his head. "It's not going to work. Garcia's just the beginning. What if there's more out there? What if other officers start talking? What if the feds start digging into everything we've done?" He stood up, pacing nervously. "We're done. We've got to make sure we can control the damage." The 2 detectives fell into a heavy silence, each of them realizing that no matter how hard they tried to manipulate the situation, they were being caught in a trap they couldn't escape. Their arrogance had blinded them, and now the truth was pulling them under. Back at the courthouse, Keller was already planning their next move. The testimony of Garcia had opened up a wealth of new avenues, and Keller wasn't going to let them go to waste. The more he dug into the case, the more he realized just how deep the corruption ran. This wasn't just about two corrupt detectives. It was about a system that had been carefully built and maintained for years, where the guilty had been protected and the innocent had been crushed. As Keller continued to prepare for the next stage of the trial, he received word that more evidence was coming to light. Documents, files, and recordings. Every piece was building the case against Mitchell and Larson. And it wasn't long before the full scale of their actions became clear. They had used their positions of power to destroy lives, framing innocent people and forcing them into guilty pleas. Their network of corruption extended far beyond Atlanta, reaching into the courts, the police department, and even the city's political leadership. The feds, led by Catherine Morrison, had been quietly working behind the scenes, compiling their own evidence. They had been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment had come. "This is bigger than just a couple of bad cops," Morrison said during a late-night meeting with Keller. "We've traced money from Mitchell and Larson's accounts to offshore companies. There's a cartel involved, and it's not just one. We're dealing with multiple international connections. This corruption extends far beyond Atlanta." Keller nodded grimly. "This is a web of corruption that's going to take down a lot of people." Isaiah, sitting in his cell, received word from his CIA handler that the next phase of the operation was about to begin. His cover may have been blown, but now he had access to the inner workings of the corrupt system, and that access was invaluable. He wasn't just going to expose Mitchell and Larson, he was going to bring down the entire network. The next morning, as the trial resumed, Keller was ready. He knew this would be the turning point, the moment when the full extent of the corruption would come to light. He had the evidence, he had the witnesses, and now he had the upper hand. "I'm calling in a few more witnesses," Keller announced as he stood before the court. "And this time, it's not just about what happened with Isaiah Carter. It's about everything, all of it." The prosecution, already reeling from Garcia's testimony, was unprepared for the flood of new information. Keller's witnesses took the stand one by one, each testifying about the illegal activities that had been carried out under Mitchell and Larson's watch. Each revelation added weight to the case, and by the end of the day, the prosecution's case was in shambles. Isaiah sat quietly watching it all unfold. He had always known that the path to justice wouldn't be easy, but now he could see the end in sight. The walls were closing in on Mitchell and Larson, and there was no escape for them. The trap was set, and all that was left was for it to snap shut. As the courtroom adjourned for the day, Isaiah's mind raced with the next steps. The corruption wasn't just about those two men. It was a cancer that had infected every level of law enforcement, and now, with the right leverage, they could take it all down. But he knew it would take time. It would take patience, strategy, and more sacrifices. The game was far from over. But for the first time, Isaiah felt like he was truly on the winning side.